Hello and welcome back to the Out of Programme podcast. Today we're joined by Dr Johann Malawana, an obstetrician and former chair of BMA's Junior Doctors Committee during the high-profile Junior Doctors dispute of 2015-2016. He is now the founder and CEO of Medics.Academy, a global health education technology company, and holds several senior academic and leadership roles, including Associate Dean for Innovation at the University of Lancashire. Hi Johann, welcome to the show.
Hi Jing, how are you?
I'm doing great. Right, we got a lot to cover, so let's dive straight in and start talking about your early career. So you trained in obs and gynae, and then you quickly moved into leadership roles. So can you talk me through what those early years look like for you?
Sure. I grew up in Northeast London, went to a state school in Northeast London, and then went to the local medical school. I actually had to move further away from my house to go to halls. So it was actually my parents were like, why are you traveling? Like, why are you actually living further away from the medical school just to go to halls? And I was like, because I want to leave home.
Understandable.
Being Sri Lankan parents, they did not understand why they were spending this money on something they didn't need to. But anyway, that was a whole different story. So I went to Barts. I spent my undergraduate time at Barts and I absolutely loved it. And I kind of fell into leadership roles at university. So I was the sabbatical president of the medical school, and then I ended up as the head of students, the head of ULU Med Group at the time, so the Medical Students Committee for the whole of the University of London, which is all 5 medical schools, so Imperial, UCL, George's, King's, and they don't like being called Kings, Guys and Tommies, and Barts in London. We don't like to be called Queen Mary. And so I did that for a couple of years, and then I was involved with the BMA and the GMC. I did all of this stuff at medical school actually, and so that was my kind of. I was always interested in leadership-y type stuff. I wasn't. I kind of fell into it, if I'm being honest, because I got involved with my student union because I was actually the bit I was interested in and enjoyed was organising the parties as opposed to actually being political. It's just, it was just that I enjoyed the party so much that I ended up doing this role, and then it turned out I was like I had an opinion which I couldn't help but share, which probably everyone else was like, please stop sharing your opinion, but I got kind of into, and so that's how I ended up doing these roles. And then and the thing is, with, as you know, like in careers, when you do something and you do it relatively okay, you kind of get the next thing and the next thing, and people ask you to do various things, and that kind of started spiraling, where I would do something and I'd often, looking back, I realized that I was quite entrepreneurial from very early on. So I kind of would always, like, I'd do a job, I'd be asked to do a job, or I'd be elected, or I'd do whatever, and then I would go and find my own twist on that job, right? So I'd go and do something, start something, or I'd scale something within the role or whatever. And so I was always like itching to make these roles better and bigger and whatever. And so that was my kind of thing. So I, in 2000, went into obstetrics. I wanted to be a surgeon, and because I had a very good house officer job at Broomfield, where I worked with some unbelievably cool surgeons, some very angry vascular surgeons. But then I worked out that all vascular surgeons tend to get angry. But I actually quite enjoyed being around them, and they were, to me, quite comedic in how they were, how they used to get really angry about stuff. So. Yeah. And like, there was like an Irish guy and a Greek guy, and they would just play with each other, and they just were like caricatures of everything you'd think about when you say those things, right? About vascular surgeons, chain smokers, angry Irish, Greek. I mean, it was just brilliant. Yeah. I had such a great experience as a house officer that I just decided I really wanted to be like that. And I applied for surgery during MTAS and didn't get it. Well, actually, to be fair, I did get it. I did get it in the end, but they didn't give it to me straight away. But there were only 2 spots, right, in London for rugby ready. Anyway, I didn't get one of those 2. I knew both of the guys who got the other 2 spots, and they were amazing, right? They were genuinely amazing guys, and I'd worked with both of them, and I could kind of see that I wasn't as good as they were. So I kind of understood why I didn't get it. And so I ended up in obs and gynae. This was in the 2007 MTAS thing, where everyone was everything, and you got, what you got, and then you decided. And I got obs and gynae. It's surgical. I'll do some surgery and then I'll reapply for surgery. And then I did obs and gynae for a year. And I said this all in the interview. I even said, I want to be a surgeon and I'll do it for a year and give it to you anyway. And anyway, so I got the job, and then I worked for the head of the School of Obs and Gynae in London. So the head of I ended up in his hospital under him. And I worked with two obstetricians particularly, who, honestly speaking, it was unbelievable. It was such an eye opener, because I have to say, at medical school, I kind of hated obs and gynae, mainly because I was in East London and no one ever let you into the room. And so I ended up in Mayday in Croydon, and I had such a good time. I could not believe how wrong I'd got this specialty, because it went from being the thing I was like most like dismissive of, to suddenly realizing it's the only reason you go and see a doctor, for a happy reason, if that makes sense, right? Yeah, I was working through all my friends and what they were doing, and I realized it was miserable, right? You go and like kind of, whatever the specialty, like the outcomes are all pretty dire, if I'm being honest. Whereas in obs and gynae, like, the baby comes out, everyone's smiling, you give them the best, happy, and then you never see them again, which is brilliant, right? So, like, because they're not like upset or complaining or dying or whatever. Hopefully, I mean, fingers crossed. But generally, it's like a really happy kind of specialty for that reason. And so I loved it. I thought it was just such a cool specialty, and I had such a good time. So I did obs and gynae as my specialty, did that for about a decade, and I loved every bit of it. But alongside that, I always had these other things bubbling around. So I led the negotiations for the BMA around MTAS, because I was so upset about the MTAS debacle that I ended up basically being appointed the head of education and training, or elected as the head of education and training for the Junior Doctors Committee. And then I led those negotiations for about 4 years. And that was cool. It was a really interesting time. And basically no one wanted to do the job, like a horrible job where everyone was arguing and upset and all this stuff. But I actually loved it. And so I ended up being quite good at, it turns out I was quite good at negotiating stuff. And so all of the whole of the kind of education environment for postgraduate education, I basically negotiate, like interunion transfer systems. I actually came up with that system and described it, and then got it negotiated. I think we did it from concept to implementation in something like 9 months, which was unheard of in that kind of system. And that system, tens of thousands of doctors have gone through it. And I wrote the original. I remember I've got the original document. I wrote this 2-page paper on why this is important, and it went through all the layers of the system, from the BMA to the Department of Health to the deans, everything, and I got it implemented within 9 months, and it then tens of thousands of doctors went through it. So it was really good. So I learned a lot of skills at the time about, that was just one of many different systems I negotiated and implemented. And so I discovered I was quite good at that stuff. But I ended up on the board of the General Medical Council, weirdly, because I was so well positioned prominently in that work, that I got appointed to the board of the GMC. Basically, there was a lot of other context, but in the end, I got appointed to the board of the GMC. And I was like 29 at the time, and everyone else on the board was like 25, 30 years older than me, and were like Sir Lord someone or other. And they were all presidents of colleges, and even the lay side. So there was half of them were doctors, half of them were lay, and the lay side were even more impressive than the doctors, because they were all like super amazing people. And I was like 25, 30 years younger than all of them. And I kind of did that for 4 years. It was just fascinating. It was a really interesting insight into the life of some very interesting people in society who had really spectacular careers. But it taught me a lot about what I wanted to do with my life, because I kind of got an insight into these 23 other people whose careers were probably some of the most spectacular in healthcare. And it kind of gave me insight into what you could do or you couldn't do with your career. Like, it wasn't so much that they helped me with my career, but it gave me lots of insight about what I wanted from my career. And so Yeah, that was brilliant. And so I then went off and I decided I was going to concentrate on being a clinician. So I stopped all my leadership roles. I
Mm.
stopped doing the BMA stuff, I stopped doing the GMC stuff, I was doing some stuff with PMET-B, I stopped doing that, and I went to Imperial to do research under a guy called Professor Mark Johnson. I was his research reg for 4 years. And and that was a really amazing experience, but I always thought I was a bit of a dumbass, right, at medical school. I was. I was, like, the guy who liked organising parties, but it turns out when I went to Imperial, I realised I'm definitely not a researcher. That is not what I
So,
so, yeah, so that's how I ended up at Imperial. So, and then I was there till just before the junior doctor, so 2015, and then, and then the junior doctor stuff happened.
so we've covered a lot of ground there, and I want to deep dive a couple of things that you described. I think the first part is, you've had a prominent political career, culminating in your role as the chair of the Junior Doctors Committee. Um, you mentioned that you kind of came for the party, but you stayed for the activism. And then you glossed over a part that I'd love to just kind of dive into a bit more, which is that what you said was you showed a bit of acumen and then you got more and more roles. And then, of course, you climbed to the top to be the chair. So could you talk a bit more about this? Because, I'm sure a lot of people will be interested to kind of hear what it was like climbing the political ranks. Well, how did you navigate that?
Okay, so that's the weird thing, right? This was the crazy part of this whole saga, was that I had actually left the BMA and all the political stuff in 2011, 2012. So I was totally out. That was the thing. I wasn't climbing. So I decided, I'd seen it. I'd gone and done all these roles. I'd been on the board of the GMC. People that talk about CVs and stuff. On my CV, there was literally nothing leadership left to do, if that makes sense. I was kind of like, right, I'm going to get my head down. I'm going to be an obstetrician. I'm going to be clinical. I'm going to go and do this. And I really want to just, and I kind of worked out that actually what was really interesting through that whole period was I also worked out I really didn't want to work in teaching hospitals. In 2014, I realised my dream job would be to work at either Barnet Hospital or Whipps Cross or somewhere like that, right? So somewhere on the kind of periphery of London that was
Hmm.
not in London, but was on the outer edge, so I could I could live in a less expensive part of the city, be close to London, but be a jobbing obstetrician and not really worry about it. So that was my goal, was to end up like, and I was really, I ended up, I fought really hard to go to Barnet Hospital to do one of my registrar rotations, because the head of school kept rotating me into teaching hospitals in London, because he was like, well, you've done all this stuff, you should be in the teaching hospital. Your career is going in this direction. I was like, no, 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 my career is going off over here. Thank you very much. And he was like, no, 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 I really think you need to do this. So he'd send me to like UCH and, all this stuff. And finally, I kind of had this big standoff with him. And I was like, I want to go to Barnet. I really want to go to, and he basically was like, fine, okay, I'll send you to Barnet. And he sent me to Barnet. And it turned, one of the consultants, it was a contemporary of mine when we started the training program together. And he was absolutely amazing. He's an amazing clinician and super nice guy, like such a nice guy. And there was one of my best friends from university was also a contemporary of mine on the program. And I kind of worked out that what I wanted to do was work with these guys. Like, this was my scenario, was to end up at Barnet with this group of guys and girls that I was friends with, and we would spend the rest of our careers working together in this hospital. And and that was what I kind of, in my head, I was like, right, I have a plan. Like, I'd
Mm.
done all that other stuff and I want to do this. And I ended up at Barnet and it was really cool. And I was loving it. I was there for 6 months. And then it was that red or blue pill moment where basically what happened is so it was the opposite of what normally happens, is that the BMA came and kind of asked me, look, we're really stuck on this negotiation scenario. Would you come and would you be interested in taking over the Junior Doctors Committee and running the negotiation? And I remember at the time, I was like, I am out of this stuff. I've been out of this stuff for like 4 years, right? I have no interest in the politics of it or anything else. But she'd asked me this thing, and then a couple of others had contacted me, and they were like, "Look, it's really got to a place where it's really hard to work out what to do, and it's
Mm,
just deteriorating. Looking back, you can't contextualize what a bad place the summer of 2015 was, right? So it was a terrible, terrible period actually for this, because we were actually at the lowest point in, like, people were leaving
mm,
and a mess and all this stuff. And so I remember having a chat with my wife, because I actually kind of knew what they were asking me to do. It wasn't like I accidentally, no, I'd negotiated stuff previously, and I knew how difficult this job is. I was like, it's not so much whether I get elected to this role, it's what the hell do you do with it once you're there? I mean, it's a poison chalice. And I'd already taken on
mm,
poison chalice 8 years before with the MTAS stuff. And at that time I didn't know what I was taking on. I just
mm,
head down, I worked my ass off, and I basically was just like absolutely going to work as hard as I can to solve that problem. And I worked really hard for like 4 years. But this time I knew exactly what I was walking into. And I said to my wife, I just don't think this is a good idea. And she was like, well, there's kind of a reason they're asking you. Like, you've done this before. Isn't that the reason? And I was like, yeah. And she was like, well, if, like, they don't normally ask people to do this kind of thing, and they kind of sound like they're very stuck. So maybe you should go and do it. And I always say to people, if you're, there's no point complaining from the sidelines. If you want to do something, just get on with it. And I don't sit there complaining about it, because it's just ridiculous. That's pointless. And so she kind of held that back to me. It was like, you always say this. So aren't you just doing exactly what you say you shouldn't do? And I was like, okay, yeah. Anyway, so I agreed. I took on the role, and so I did that for 11 months, and it was intense, to say the least.
I mean, it's so interesting hearing this because essentially you'd stepped away. Whenever I think about, those in politics, I think about career politicians that do everything to climb to the top. But what you're describing is you walked away from it. You wanted to have that, essentially that DGH life where you were working with your friends as obstetricians, but then there was a calling and you were a reluctant leader that then took on the responsibility because they believed that you were one of the few that was capable of taking on the challenge.
I don't. I mean, to be honest, I'm not sure that is necessarily true. I think I had a unique set of experiences that
Mm,
allowed me to pattern recognition. I mean, this is like actually surgery 101, right? The reason why most surgeons becomes very good at their job, because they've done it so many times that they disengage their brain and their hands take over. That's the whole
mm,
concept of surgery, right? That actually, if you have a surgeon who is actively thinking about surgery, you've got a problem. I always say this to my patients, right? Unlike in every other field of surgery, obstetrics, the patients are usually awake, right? Which is a real issue, right? And so obstetric patients usually used to, like, it's really weird, right? The surgeons were talking about everything during my surgery that was not my surgery. They were like talking about their holidays, and they were talking about
mm.
this and they were talking about that. And they were like talking to me. And why aren't they concentrating on the surgery, right? And I always used to say to my friends and anyone going through childbirth was that the moment a surgeon in obstetrics stops talking about anything else, and like if there's either silence or they're talking about the surgery, that's when you should be worried, right? Because then they're actually having to concentrate. What you want is them not having to concentrate, where it's just totally routine and their hands are just doing their task and their head can concentrate on something else. And they're just like so relaxed about the surgery that everything is going fine, right? That's what you really want, right? Because what that means is that muscle memory is basically doing the task, and their head is thinking about what. And actually, I think, to put it simplistically, it wasn't that I was somehow, brilliant or anything like that. It was just that I was weirdly had done this before. I'd negotiated a complex set of scenarios before, which actually was quite rare in the medical profession. Like it is, because the weird thing in medicine is that we tend to have a lot of very articulate, intelligent people, and so therefore often problem solving can be done from within the field, as it were. You don't bring in an expert on some minuscule thing, doesn't understand the context. And the weird thing with medicine is that you have clinicians who understand both the context and have the intellectual capacity to solve the specific problem. And those two combinations can be really valuable, right? So if you want to negotiate something, you actually want someone to understand the context as well as the process, as it were. And the weird thing was, I was just in a weird place where I'd done a series of tasks and roles that gave me a set of experiences that put me in a relatively unique place to be able to do something that was even more complicated and more horrendously difficult. And so I definitely would not pretend that I was some sort of
Mm.
genius that could solve this problem. It was just pattern recognition, right? I'd done it before.
I'm sure you're playing it down a little bit, but it's great to kind of hear how you think about these things. Now, I would love to kind of hear more about what it was like in that crucible, because you said you went through an 11-month kind of negotiation. What was it like negotiating with government? What was it like interacting with Jeremy Hunt?
Yeah. I mean, I think Jeremy Hunt doesn't like me very much, but I honestly didn't mind the guy. I thought it was fine. I mean, he was a politician. He is the quintessential politician, right? He had a very specific view. He's got political ambitions, and he pushed the medical profession too hard in the summer of 2015, and he didn't recognize what he'd done. And I think it was really weird because he blamed me in the BMA for a lot of what he had provoked. And it's weird when you watch the politicians interacting with the medical profession now. I'm not talking one side or the other because they both do it, right? Is that they don't quite understand the population they're dealing with. And that's the fundamental problem. And I remember saying to him on several occasions, look, I know you think I'm difficult, but honestly speaking, I'm not that difficult. You should see who's behind me, right? And like, if you want to deal with them, you should deal with them, right? If you think I'm the problem here. And so I was like, I had a very specific task I was there to do, which was to solve a complex problem where there were two sides of a difficult equation that needed to somehow balance, and neither side wanted to find common ground. That was the problem, right?
Mhm.
And the reality was that I had no interest in a political career. Like, as soon as that negotiation was over, I remember getting offered a whole series of political jobs, and I was just not interested. Right? There was no way I wanted to go into politics and rise up the ranks and all of that. That was not my goal. And so, actually, in lots of ways, it allowed me the freedom to be just to try and solve the problem in the middle, if that makes sense. And I'll be honest, ultimately, as much as everyone loves to criticize and blah, 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 and I'm sure everyone could have done it better because everyone knows they could have done it better than I did. So I read that all the time online, what a useless loser he is and all this stuff. But ultimately, the reality was that it was the first time that clinicians actually went on industrial action, which in itself was a massive deal. And remember, the weird thing was that I cancelled the first strike. So I was not out to go on strike, if that makes sense, right? I was absolutely not. Like, I remember cancelling the first day of strike action. And I remember the absolute, like, animosity I got from doctors about the fact that I'd cancelled a strike, right? And I was like very clear that my job was to negotiate a deal. I was not there to bring down a government or anything else like that. I was there to negotiate a contract, right? And essentially this was a tool to get the negotiation sorted. And the medical profession hadn't taken industrial action successfully. I mean, we'd done some flirting with it in 2012 with the pensions thing, but it was a complete disaster. And basically, we hadn't gone on proper industrial action for like 40 something years. And so there was no muscle memory in the profession about how to actually how to do complex negotiations with government at that level of industrial relations, right? And so we just didn't have the internal metrics to understand this problem, if that makes sense. And so, I remember cancelling the first day of industrial action in December. I remember it was like December the 3rd or something, 2015. And I remember the absolute vitriol I got from clinicians. Like, it was so abusive, right? And my wife was watching all of this on Facebook. And, it was just like poisonous, like the crap that was coming. And she was like, my God, what have you done? Like, why didn't you just let them have a little strike just to kind of keep them on side and all this? And I was like, because ultimately I've got to do the right thing, right? I'm not here to give everyone like an easy out. I'm here to to get this deal, right? And it was so crazy. And then eventually we did go on industrial action. But I fundamentally believed in trying to sort out the deal, and industrial action was a tool. It wasn't the goal. And so, to me, if we could get to a deal that would work, then that was the goal, right? Remember, this is the most complicated public sector contract in the British society, right? Because if you imagine there are 50,000 clinicians, they are the most pivotal part of the health service. The health service accounts currently for £200 billion of public spending, right? It is about something like 25% of GDP we spend on the health service, or something stupid like that, right? It is, and this 50,000 individuals are the most pivotal part of the health service, i.e., if you take out lots of elements of the health service, you can kind of work out how to, but if you take the junior doctors out, who do a lot of the most, like, propping up of the service, then you end up with a real problem, right? And the reality was that we had a contract structure that had been there for 20 years, but to find a contract that would work, needed to understand there were 56 specialties, right? And there was a 24-hour clock. And if you take one of the lab specialties like microbiology and you compared it to transplant surgery, there was huge, you had to use the same contractual framework, but for completely different kind of processes, right? And at the time, the government were using an error bar of something like 10%. Right. It was like crazy numbers. Right. And I managed to pull together it was so many elements of this. You had to run like a complex mathematical problem, which I had a separate team doing, who were just geniuses. They were super brilliant, right? Like super smart people. And then you had to run a political campaign, and then you had to run a media campaign, and then you had to run an actual negotiation scenario. So there was all these different elements that I was responsible for. And remember, the BMA had never done this before. So you also kind of writing the book on this. And there was a lot of resistance at the time from within the profession, within the BMA, within government, all of this stuff. And then you had this really complicated contract to solve. And so, and the thing I always think is, people will hate me for saying this, but the contractual framework I designed, I wrote it all out on the white whiteboard. People were trying to tinker with what they already had. And the problem with it is, once it was such an established contract, it was really hard to tinker because everyone knew what was going on, right? So in order to genuinely get to a new outcome, you kind of had to start from first principles and rethink the entire framework, because things like safety and education frameworks and all of that, none of that was in the contract, right? It was all that the contract only dealt with pay. So suddenly you had all these other complexities that we were desperate to include because they were so fundamental to the working lives and experience of doctors, right? And you had to factor these all in, and these had complex interactions and interrelationships with the payments structure and so I designed this whole framework on this whiteboard and kind of took into account all the elements that doctors wanted. And then we had the complicated journey of taking that and turning it into something that actually worked, that would work within the public sector. And that was what I basically had to do over 9 months with my team. And that was an incredible team. I mean, like, genuinely, this is not a one-man band at all, right? There was like an unbelievable team of people behind this, loads of people involved. And you had to coordinate all of them and get them all to kind of work together. And then you had all of the outside issues. And so yeah, it was a very, very complicated time, but it was a very interesting problem to solve, and I quite like solving problems. So it was just one of those things. And whether the thing I always say to people is that ultimately, if I got it wrong, it's still the contract we use. So I can't have got it that wrong, if that makes sense, right? And so, a decade later, if anyone ever wants to renegotiate that contract, truly renegotiate the framework of that contract, I don't think that's going to happen for another 20 years. But if they genuinely do, good luck to them, right? Because if someone has that level of ambition, please go ahead. I really don't mind. I would love to be able to draw a line under it and say, right, but yeah, we are where we are. So that was
I
it.
mean, it sounds like history is going to repeat itself and someone's going to give you a call again.
Yeah, I have to say, I don't think so. I think the thing I've learned is that I am not the easiest person to work with. I've learned that lesson, right? Everyone says this about me, is that because I'm absolutely fixated on a goal, right? If I know what I'm trying to do, I'm like fixated, and that can really get people, like, I can put people's backs up because I'm so goal orientated and so obsessive about things that basically you have to really want to work with me to work with me. Makes sense. And so the weird thing is, a lot of the people that now work with me have often been on the other side of the table to me, which is a really weird scenario, right? But a lot of people that end up hiring me to do projects or doing various things or getting me in to do something often have been on the other side of the table to me. And I find that really weird. And I remember once asking someone about this, because this has happened so many times, multiple times, that I always ask them, why do you want me to come and help you work on this? And they're like, well, to be honest, Johann, you are the most irritating person I've ever worked with. And actually, I'd kind of rather have you on my side of the table than on the other side. If that makes sense.
What a reputation. Well, that's been an incredible kind of insight into really historic period of time. And I remember, the junior doctor strikes happened when I just started as a junior doctor myself. This was in my foundation year 1. And it's so funny hearing you today because, I'm casting my mind back to when, to how I perceive things. And you were definitely a very abstract character in this kind of pantomime of a situation.
Character. I love that.
Yeah.
Abstract character. You gotta remember that one.
Yeah, well, in all the junior doctor common rooms, like, a lot of opinions get thrown around. And I'm sure at one point I probably thought, oh, that Johann, what a jerk. I could do a much better job. So it's really, it's a really great moment for me to be speaking to you.
Right, you're like 10 years later, my sons agree with you, right? That is their go-to opinion on me, right? Is that Dad, he's such a jerk, right?
But like, you've covered this a little bit in what you've said, but you had to cope with enormous amount of pressure and public scrutiny, both from, of course, the government that thought you were a jerk, the junior doctor body that thought you were a jerk, and evidently your children as well. But, anyone listening to this
maybe the
think,
lesson they're doing is that I am a jerk, and that's the problem. Maybe I need
if the shoe fits,
a therapist and work out why I'm such an idiot, right? So,
but you're incredibly upbeat. So I wanted to ask, like, how did you handle all of this? You must have been getting attacked from all fronts, and you're pretty chipper about things today.
What's really weird about this whole scenario is that in the middle of all this, my wife is pregnant with our second child, right? So my son, we had to move, and this sounds unbelievably terrible when you say it out loud, and I know that this is socially unacceptable, so I'll get a load of shit about this as well. Basically, we actually had to move the date. But because my son was delivered by cesarean, so we had to move the date of birth of my son because of the strikes and the negotiation.
Wow.
Right. And I remember going to our obstetrician, who happened to be my old boss, so he was like a really decent guy. And I remember saying to him, so Mark, we need to move the date of delivery for Sarah. And he was like, Johann, what are you talking about? And I was like, I actually need to move this date because I can't because of like other stuff. And he was like, Johann, I'm the professor of obstetrics at Imperial. Like, you cannot, like, you don't just move the date of birth because of a work thing, right? And I was like, Mark, go on your phone, open up the Times newspaper and read what they're writing about me, right? And he looked at his phone and he went, oh yeah, okay, fine. Yeah, we'll move the date of birth. It's fine, right? And I remember going to my wife and saying to her, Mark has agreed that we can move the date. And she was like, I honestly don't know how you've had that conversation. That is the most ridiculous conversation I've ever heard, right? And and so, yeah, so so in the middle of all of this, whilst all of that was happening, I was also me and my wife were having a kid, and I remember my wife was heavily pregnant, like super heavily pregnant. And I think it was one of the newspapers, I can't remember which one, but one of the reporters like was banging on the door of our home, our house, and basically was like asking my wife, like, because I wasn't in, I was obviously out doing like, around the country or whatever. And she and my wife opened the door, and he, no, it was a woman, right? This was the thing. It was a woman. So went into like a bit of a tirade, like, oh my God, what do you say? Blah, 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 blah. And she like opened the door and she was like, just to be clear, I have no idea what you're talking about. But as you can see, I'm really not the person you want to talk to right now. And like, she's like out here heavily pregnant. And this woman just looked down at her tummy and was like, oh, I'm really sorry. Yeah, okay, I'll see you later. Bye. And literally turned around and legged it, right? Because she'd like kind of realized this was probably not the most appropriate, like, doorstepping activity she could have done. And so, yeah, so that was all going on in the background as well. So.
Right. Well, we need to now move on from the junior doctor's contract into
Yeah.
your very lengthy subsequent career. So you then took a bit of a step back from frontline medicine and you went on to build Medics.Academy, which is what you then went on to do, having, had your illustrious career in politics. So can you talk to me about how that all began? What was the motivation and what was the journey like starting that business?
Sure. Okay, so I mean, having gone through that experience, I was really aware, not just the junior doctor stuff, but actually the whole previous decade of work. I was kind of really aware of what motivated me, and it taught me a real lesson about the rest of my career. And it kind of taught me what I wasn't interested in, right? Don't get me wrong. I really am interested in politics as like the political world, as in I'm not someone who doesn't watch the news. I watch the news. I read newspapers. I'm super engaged with the world around me. But I realized I wanted to genuinely impact in a change manner the outcomes I was trying to get to, rather than holding a position of power, if that made sense, right? So there are some things that you realize as you're going through life, which is that for me, a position of power was, whilst interesting, it was a function of trying to get something changed and improving the world around me, rather than holding the position for the sake of holding the position, as it were. And so I looked around at that period, and during that period, I really reflected on it, and I really thought about, like, I mean, I was extremely lucky, super lucky, right? Because I basically got to work with some of the most interesting people, right? And really smart people, done incredible careers and stuff like that. And what I learned, what I spent time thinking about, is what motivates me, and why do I want to do things, and what do I like. And I kind of worked out that I need to spend the next. You have limit. Time is just so limited in life, right? And you've only a certain amount of time. And so I kind of thought, well, I actually want to go and work on something. I loved obstetrics. Don't get me wrong. I thought obstetrics was the best specialty. I thought it was such a great career. I loved operating. I loved delivering babies. I really loved the NHS. I think that the system is really good. But I realized I just get so frustrated in this system. What I also learned along the way is that I worked in over the years. I spent a lot of time working with outside agencies that work with the health service. And what was fascinating was how much different parties would listen to people who were coming in from outside, even though the expertise was often inside the organization. And it was this weird scenario where people just didn't listen to what was going on inside. They spent all their time listening to the outside, if that makes sense. And actually that really frustrated me. And so I realized that if they're not going to listen to me inside the organization, maybe I should be the one outside the organization, right?
Mm.
And so this is what I did. So I went and started this. And I mean, you know, when you start something like this, you always believe you're going to be the next Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos.
Of
Like in your
course, I
head,
still do.
yeah. You know, you're like, I'm gonna be like going to the Mars. I'm going to Mars. I'm going to basically build rockets. I'm gonna be like a billionaire on his yacht. All of that stuff, right? I started this tech kind of education company, and part of me was like, oh yeah, like imagine if I ended up like, da-da. But you very soon realize, right? If you want to make a lot of money, build an online pharmacy. That's the way to go in healthcare, right? Or if you build a calculator that has a low like complexity but not too much. There's certain business models within healthcare that can make money, and there are certain business models that absolutely never make any money, right? And basically, education is one of those areas where basically it is a totally terrible area to work in terms of if you're thinking about scale and money and finance and all of this stuff, because it's a complex problem, right? On one side, you've got horribly, horribly complicated healthcare, and on the other side, you've got horribly complicated university education, royal colleges. And what you realize is that usually when you're starting something in the middle of that, on both sides, the institutions both have the word royal often in front of their name, right? And they have histories that go back hundreds of years, right? And so literally they are the most horrible organizations to try and innovate and move in a different direction, because they've done everything in a certain way for a very long time, and they fundamentally do not want to change, right? And basically, I learned very quickly, and I kind of knew this already given the history of what I was doing, that this is not an easy kind of environment to work in.
Mm.
I also knew that if I was going to spend the next 30, 40 years of my life, I had to do it in something I genuinely wanted to spend my life doing, as it were. And so I started Medics.Academy with other people, and it was ultimately just to solve a problem and to work on something that I knew I wanted to work on for the rest of my career. And so I approached it in that vein of like, you know, I know what I want to do for the next 30 or 40 years of my life. I don't really want to spend my life answering to someone who I want to be able to solve problems, and I want to solve the problems in front of me. I don't want to end up over and over again being told, no, you can't do this. You can't work on that because that's not the goal. So I knew that if I carried on in the NHS or I carried on in a university role, there'd be a limit to my ability to work on the things I wanted to work on. And so I had to go and do it in a way where you genuinely had a bit more freedom. And that's why I did it. And I have to say, I mean, I have an unbelievable set of mentors and, you know, really caring people that are successful and make a massive effort with me and put a lot of time and effort into giving me advice and stuff like that. And I'm so eternally grateful to all the people that like helped me. But I remember lots of them said to me at the time, "What the hell are you doing? Like, why are you doing this?" Right? Because I remember one particular person said to me, "Johann, this is the worst career move I've ever heard anyone ever make." And I was like, "Okay, thanks." And she said to me, "Johann, you have the most incredible CV. You are going to end up in like a senior medical role very, very easily. Like it's not even under, you know, you will end up in these. Why are you doing this? You're giving that all up to go and do what? Start a company? What the hell?" Like, I genuinely was like, yeah, but I have to say, in 30 years' time, I've worked with those people. I know what that job, and I also know the unbelievable levels of frustration that they suffer from, right? I know that these are genuinely well-meaning people, often people that go into political careers or go into leadership careers. Like, there are some that, frankly, you know, do it for very odd reasons, but genuinely, a lot of them like care. They want to do something right. They want to do the right thing, but they spend so long getting to make a decision, like getting to the point of being able to make a decision, that they lose along the way the passion of why they're on that journey, if that makes sense. And so I just knew I didn't want to be that person. And I knew I kind of had worked with enough people of that ilk that basically I respected them deeply, but I knew that what I'd learned where their frustrations were, and I didn't want to repeat those mistakes. So I kind of decided I was going to go in a different direction, which most people thought was absolutely nuts, absolutely crazy, right? But my wife, the weird thing is that my wife is unbelievably supportive and helpful.
Mm.
And she basically, again, Sarah was just like, yeah, I think you should go. I mean, what was it? I remember she said this thing to me like years ago, and she said, I've watched you do some really weird things in your career, and they are genuinely odd, right? Like that, and yet somehow it kind of works, and like, to be honest, I think you should just go and do whatever you want to do and not worry about what other people think. And I was like, cool, okay, well, that's good advice. And then I remind her of that, and I'm like, you told me, you said it was okay, right? And so she and she does get frustrated with me every now and then, but but I'm like, well, you kind of gave me a permission structure to do this, so it's not my fault.
And for the benefit of the audience, can you share a bit more about what Medics.Academy is? Because I think it's fairly ambitious and unconventional, and I think it just really contextualize things for them.
Yeah, sure. So we basically build education programs and products. I mean, we build predominantly, what we want to do is eventually be able to deliver education at scale to both parts of health systems that can afford to pay for it, but also equally to health systems that can't afford to pay for it. And that's what we've lived our whole mission around, right? So we do standard commercialized projects often for partners. So it splits into two things. It's either primary delivery of education products. So we will work with 11 universities to deliver components of their undergraduate or postgraduate programs. We work with a lot of the NHS, probably about 25% of the English NHS. We've worked with the WHO, we've worked with UNICEF, we've worked with multinational agencies, we've worked in countries outside of the UK, we worked in Africa, Asia, in lots of different places around the world. We've done a lot of work in North America. So we work in lots of environments to kind of solve complicated education problems. But weirdly, because of that, there's a second part of the business, which is essentially complex problem solving. So we get asked to come in and solve interesting problems in that space as well. So there's two parts of the business. One is this kind of standard education program stuff, which is what I'm passionately. I mean, I'm an educator still, right? I still teach, I still do lectures, I still talk to students, etc. And obviously, my subsequent career now, I work in a medical school part time, right? So I'm the associate dean for innovation at a medical school, and again, really weird career path, right? Because I remember saying at the interview, I'm not qualified for this job, by the way, right? And they were like, well, that's kind of why we're hiring you, because you aren't qualified for this job. You're like really outside of the box, right? And so, and basically, and essentially I do a lot of so my team, I've built a team, we've got like 60 or 70 people across the world, and basically we do complex problem solving for interesting institutions, but we also deliver a standard education programs in lots of institutions, and often we'll approach problems in a bit of an interesting way and that kind of thing, and I have to say we do very little outward marketing, so we do very little outward sales, as it were. Virtually all of our business comes from inbound queries. People come to me and talk to me
Mm.
stuff they do, and they like, can you solve this problem, can you do this, can you do that? I hoover up information, so I love listening to your podcast, other podcasts, I love listening to, reading things, I love doing, and I listen to a lot of people, but especially things like how to sell into the NHS. That's my favorite kind of podcast. I have people, right, how do you sell into complex organizations? And the weird thing is that we've never really gone through that problem because we've never done outbound sales. We've always the work's always inbound, right? So it's always like people approaching us and saying, can you solve this problem, or can you solve that problem, and how much would it cost to do this or whatever? And so that's what I've basically spent the last decade doing, is like people approach me and are like, I've got this horrendously weird problem. Can you solve this for me? And what's the really interesting ones we get is when people say things like, this has happened more than once, right? I've got a team that is meant to work on this, and yet they cannot seem to do it. I need someone to come and do it for them, and then like show them how to do it, right? And so we do this a lot, right? So someone has got a budget to do something, and for whatever reason, they cannot seem to get it over the line, right? They can't make it work, right?
Mm,
And often I get called in with my team to then work out how to like solve that problem.
mm.
That's one side of the business. The other side of the business is what I actually love and care about, which is education. So like education solutions. So we build education programs, and I've got a phenomenal group of academics and clinicians and various other people who work within the organization or work around the organization. There's like 150 odd people, right? Who are like, work around the organization, who are clinicians, academics, etc. And they kind of like help us deliver programs and stuff like that. And more importantly, the other part of this is the HLA, right? So the HLA is weird in that it is a not-for-profit social enterprise. It does not have, like, it does not work if you do the standard, like the NHS. I think we spent something like £15 million on something like the Clinical Leaders Network. We spend about £5 million a year on things like the NHS Leadership Academy. We spend the Clinical Entrepreneurial Program. We spend millions on that stuff. FMLMs. We built. So I know how the health service thinks, and they throw money at problems. But we built the HLA kind of in a weird way where it's completely free at the point of delivery, right? So it genuinely is free for anyone that applies to the Scholars Program from anywhere in the world, but it is hyper competitive, right? Super, super competitive. And you apply to the program, and you can be, so when we started, it was all medical students and like very junior doctors, but it's now anyone from anywhere in the world at any stage in their career. So we often have some very senior clinicians. I've got people right now on the program. We've got I think we've got an associate dean. We've got various people, and people from other countries that are very senior in their clinical professions, et cetera, et cetera. And they apply to the program to spend a year thinking about leadership, but there is no cost base. They have to sometimes they ask to pay for they might pay for they have to sort themselves out with travel, and they have to sort themselves out with this and that. But the fundamental thing is that if you had to pay for this program, like genuinely, if you had to pay for this program, I know because I've benchmarked it and I've worked in enough institutions where I've had to price the equivalent program up. You would basically be charging about between £15,000 and £35,000 for the program we deliver, and we do it free. And you can apply from
Wow.
anywhere in the world, right? And we basically, the wonderful thing is that Medics.Academy lets me do this. So whereas people make these weird commitments that we spend 1% on social justice, or we spend 10% on charity or whatever, we actually spend an enormous amount of money from our budget on this because we believe in this. And why did I start the business, and why does everyone around me want to work on this? Is because this is our mission. This is our fundamental, is how you help health systems grow and build and all of this stuff. So, as commercial businesses go, we are a commercial business, but we are a commercial business partly because it gives me the complete freedom to do this thing where I can deliver something that no one else can deliver in a model. Like we still get, to be clear, we get lots of support funding now from like NHS and from partners and various, but we have to, because otherwise we won't be able to continue to grow the program. But we basically are able to make rational decisions for the long term without the short-term impetus of politics getting involved and saying, you can't do that. I just look at things like NHSX, right? We as a country spent £50 million on NHSX, and it lasted 18 months.
Wow.
That's ridiculous, right? That is ridiculous, right? So when we talk about wastage in the health service, Like, why didn't we do something with all of that money? Like, where did we spend all of that? And that's what really frustrated me. And so to me, we've spent a decade working on HLA, and we've worked in war zones. We've built programs in Tigray in Ethiopia. We've worked in, like, we're doing a big project right now in Zimbabwe. We're doing projects in all over the world. I mean, like, lots of stuff in Africa that you just wouldn't be able to do if you did it any other way.
I mean, wow. I can see how you've structured it to both generate profit, but also to work on the things that you're passionate about. And it all
I have to
synergizes with
say,
each other.
my wife wishes we generated profits. The problem is you're now hearing why that may not be the actual.
Yeah, it's beginning to make sense. But look, I could listen to you all day, but we're running out of time, unfortunately. So to finish things, I want to ask you one last question, which is, what advice would you give to clinicians today who are thinking about stepping away from the traditional training pathway?
Okay, that's a good question. So I have a very standard answer for this because I've been asked it so many times, right? My view on this is that you have to run towards something. Don't run away from something. Okay? And the reason I say that is because the grass is not always greener.
For
In fact,
sure,
if
yeah.
anything, the grass may be green, but there's a load of dog poo in it, right? And so basically, I say this because my dog's standing right there and I'm looking at him. I better take him out soon. Right. So basically, the grass is not always greener. And so if you are running away from something, sometimes the thing you're running towards is not what you expect it to be. Okay. So just make sure you're running towards something, not running away from something. That would be the fundamental advice I'd give anyone in any context, but certainly to clinicians. Because let me be clear on something. Whilst I've gone and done all this random stuff, I fundamentally, in my core of core, heart of hearts, I think being a doctor is the most enormous privilege that you can have. So, I actually work more with doctors now than I ever did as a clinician because I have doctors all around me. I have clinicians all around me,
Mm.
not doctors, nurses, everyone else, right? And I probably work with more clinicians now than I ever worked with in my clinical career. And I just think it's such an incredible career and job. And my passion is really to solve problems in health systems because I really believe in health systems. I think that how we support and help um, society and how we make it productive is to understand that actually health is a really important part of that. Now, that said, I have got probably quite weird views about how you spend money on health, and probably ones that people might be quite surprised by. But having been on all sides of this, from the trade union side, I'm very much a kind of left leaning socialist. At the other side, I've run a commercial business. I know what it's like to have to keep, and I don't mean making a profit, to be clear. My biggest issue, and I've said this to one of my staff this week, is I have to make sure that I pay the salaries of my staff. These people's lives are on me, right? If I can't pay their salaries, that means they can't pay their rent. They can't have their kids sorted out. They can't, this weighs on me like massively, right? And so that's the thing I think you've just got to really think about is like, what are you running towards? Why do you want to do something? And do you really want to? And being a doctor is such an enormous privilege. It's such a great, like, if I say to people, I run a business, there's a general eye roll about that. Oh, okay. Like doctors are all like, "Oh, tell me about that." But everyone else is like, "Oh, right, yeah." You tell someone, "Oh, yeah, I'm a medic. I used to be a surgeon. I used to be a obstetrician in the NHS. I delivered babies." They actually listen to you. Like they really are, they're interested in that, right? And so it's an enormous privilege to get to do being a clinician. So I think, if I was giving advice to clinicians, I think my advice is somewhat counterintuitive in that basically I would say to them, just be sure what you're running towards as opposed to what you were running away from, because actually being a doctor is like such a privilege. It's such a cool job. And I got to do, I mean, I delivered nearly 1,000 babies in my career, right? And every single one of them was just like miraculous. It was such a brilliant job. It was so cool, right? And you get to deliver babies and you get to bring them into the world and you get to, I mean, maybe I'm doing a sales piece on obstetrics, but it is like kind of, it was just an enormously privileged role. And I loved it. It was genuinely cool.
I think that's, yeah, I think that's fantastic. And I think it's really good balance. You know, I often talk about push and pull factors, and you have to have the pull factors. It can't all be push, which is where I think some of the narrative lies today. And honestly, when people ask me about career decisions, I also say the same. I say think twice, because it is an enormous privilege to be a clinician. And I do regret the camaraderie. I regret it, you know, not being right at the front line and actually clinically practicing. But you know, we make our choices, and that's how it how it all
Yeah, I
lands.
mean, I say, you know, the job I do now, I love, you know, don't get me wrong. Again, you know, I love what I'm doing, but I think sometimes the grass is not always greener, is my point. Is that
Trade-offs, right?
yeah, yeah, and so in my previous life, right, if I go on the news and I tell them some sad story about being a hard-working doctor and the difficulties I had, people genuinely feel sympathy and empathy for me, right? Because they really respect
Mm.
what we did and what I used to do and what I do. If I go and talk about the complexities of running a business, right, and how difficult my life is, you know what? I think I'm an idiot, right? I'm like, what the hell are you talking about, right? So imagine what everyone else is thinking, right? So I just have to, you know, if you use the benchmark of what other people think, right? I think that sometimes people just don't sometimes don't spend enough time thinking and reflecting on what motivates them and why they're doing things and all this stuff, right? And actually, you know, like what drives me is that I get to do the stuff I do, but you know, we haven't talked about anything to do with the technology and the academia stuff now. But you know, if I look at that stuff, I basically managed to bypass a whole series of roles that I would have normally had to do to
Mm.
get positions I've got to now. And I look back and I think um about what I'm doing now, and I think about it is really interesting because you know, in the medical school or in the work I do, you end up working with people and you realize actually, because I was really dismissive of my own experience, right? I was like, oh well, you know, I don't have this qualification, I don't have that thing, I don't, and I'd be like, oh, but this person has all of these things. So I felt like a genuine imposter syndrome around.
Mm. Mm.
And then I realized that much of my experience is stuff that just it is this weird scenario where there's a reason why in complex organizations they need someone to think about things in a certain way in order to move the organization forward. And actually, that's kind of what I really care about is fundamentally how do we provide societies with health systems that their society can take advantage of and use, i.e., not the rich and few privileged people, but the
Mm.
vast majority of them. And I think whether you're in the public or private sector, those are just tools and vehicles, if I'm being honest, because I work in the commercial sector, and yet
Mm.
we
Mm.
spend an enormous amount, and what way more of our resource is funneled and focused on making impact and change. And yet a lot of resources, I often work, you know, we work with a lot of organizations where resources not funneled in that way. And that's not because people don't care. That's because people, there's a variety of reasons why it's hard to make those organizations work. And the weird thing is, I'm not one way or another. I'm not fundamentally about the private sector. I'm not fundamentally about the public sector because I've worked in both. I work in both and I care about
Mm.
getting to the outcome, not the kind of ideology of the way you kind of travel that journey, if that makes sense.
Brilliant. Brilliant. So that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining me, Johann. And for those listening, if you like what you hear and you want to support the show, please do like and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or whatever podcast platform you're currently listening to us on. It would mean a lot to me and it would help spread the message to others exploring alternative paths. Thank you for joining us and see you next time. Bye bye.